I found an awesome book at an antique store that has children's stories, fairy tales from all over the world. And I thought it would be cool to read some of them and share the YouTube link with my kids at school. And so that's what I'm going to do. And I figured New Year's Day was a good time to start. So the first story is The Snow Queen by Hans Christian Andersen. It's sub-zero out there, and so it seems like an appropriate beginning story. Here are the illustrations. Once there was a devilish hobgoblin. One day he made a mirror which caused all that was good and beautiful, when it was reflected therein, to look poor and mean. The best persons were turned into frights, or appeared to stand on their heads. "That's glorious fun," said the hobgoblin. Then all the other hobgoblins told each other that now only could they see the world as it really looked. And they ran about with the mirror until at last there was not a land or a person that was not represented there, twisted all out of shape. Then they flew up into the sky, meaning to have some fun there. But the mirror was now grinning terribly at the malicious joke it was playing, and suddenly it shook so with its grinning that it flew out of the hobgoblin's hands and fell to the earth, where it was dashed into 100,000,000 pieces. And now it worked much more evil than before, for some of these pieces were hardly as large as a grain of sand. They flew about in the wide world, and when they got into people's eyes, there they stayed. Then people saw everything distorted, or only had an eye for that which was evil. Sometimes someone even got a splinter in his heart, and then his heart became a lump of ice. Now we shall hear what happened. In a large town, where there were so many houses and so many people that there was no room left for everybody to have a garden, there lived a boy and a girl. They were not brother and sister, but they loved each other just as much as if they were. Their parents lived opposite each other in 2 attic rooms. The roof of one house just touched the roof of the other, with only a rainwater gutter between them. They each had a little dormer window, so one had only to step over the gutter to get from one window to the other. Out on the roof, the parents had placed 2 wooden boxes in which grew pea vines, vegetables, and some little rose trees. And in summer, the boy and the girl sat out on the roof among the roses. In winter it was different. Often the windows were frozen over, but then the 2 heated copper pennies on the stove and laid the hot pennies on the window pane. Thus they made capital peepholes through which to look out at each other. The boy's name was Kay, the girl's was Gerda. One day there was quite a snowstorm. "Is it the white bees that are swarming?" said Kay's old grandmother. "Do the white bees choose a queen?" asked Kay, for he knew that the honey bees always have one. "Yes," said the grandmother. "The Snow Queen flies where the swarm hangs in the thickest clusters. Many a winter's night she flits through the streets and peeps in at the windows, and then they freeze in wonderful patterns that look like flowers." That evening Kay made himself a peephole with a heated penny and looked out the window. A few snowflakes were falling, and one, the largest of all, remained on the edge of a flower pot. Larger and larger grew that flake of snow. At last it was like a beautiful maiden, dressed in the finest white gauze, made of 1,000,000 little flakes like stars. She was so lovely, so delicate. But she was of ice, of dazzling, sparkling ice. Her eyes glittered like 2 stars. She nodded toward the window and beckoned with her hand. Kay was so frightened that he ducked his head below the peephole. But as he did so, he fancied that a great white bird flew away. Then the spring came, the sun shone, green leaves appeared, swallows built their nests, windows were opened, and Kay and Gerda again sat in their garden high up on the roof of the top of the house. Gerda had learned a hymn in which there was something about roses. She sang it to Kay, who then sang it with her. The rose in the valley is blooming so sweet. The child Jesus is there the children to greet. And the two were happy singing together out there in the sunshine, with the roses all in bloom about them. But one day Kay cried out suddenly, "Oh, something struck me sharply, in the heart, and something's got into my eye." Gerda threw her arms around his neck. Then he winked and blinked, and Gerda looked to see if she could find anything in either of his eyes. But she could see nothing at all. "I think it's out now," said he, but it was not. It was one of those pieces of glass that had got into his eye, a splinter from the magic mirror that made everything great and good look mean and ugly. And poor Kay had got another piece right in his heart, which began to turn into a lump of ice. And now he looked so strange that Gerda started to cry. "Why do you cry?" Kay demanded. "You look so ugly when you cry." And then he looked at the roses. "And those roses, how ugly are they?" he shouted. "That one's worm-eating. This one's stunted." And giving the box a kick, he broke off both roses. "What are you doing?" cried Gerda in alarm. But he did not answer her. Turning away, he ran in at his window and left her there alone. After that, Kay was never the same boy he had been. He started to sneer at people and mimic them. He would get behind his grandmother and mimic her way of speaking. And soon he was able to imitate the gait and manner of everyone in the street. Everything that was peculiar and displeasing in them, that Kay made fun of. It was the glass he had got in his eye, the glass that was sticking in his heart, which made him tease even Gerda, whose soul was devoted to him. One day Kay went out with his sled. "I'm going to the marketplace to play with the boys," he bawled to Gerda, and away he went. In the marketplace the big boys were hitching their sleds to carts and getting a ride in that way. Kay was enjoying this sport with the rest of them when all at once a large sleigh appeared in the square. It was painted white. There was someone in it who wore a white fur coat and cap, and the horse was white. Twice that sleigh drove round the square. Then Kay tied his sled to it, and off he went. The person who drove turned around to Kay and nodded to him in a friendly manner, just as if they knew each other. So on they went till they came outside the gates of the town. Then the snow began to fall so thickly that the boy could not see an arm's length before him. Suddenly he got the string he held in his hand in order to get loose from the big sleigh, but it was of no use. His sled hung fast, and on he went like the wind. He was quite frightened, and he tried to repeat the Lord's Prayer, but he was only able to remember the multiplication table. The snowflakes grew larger and larger, till they looked like great white birds. Then suddenly the sleigh stopped, and the person who drove rose up. It was a lady, tall, slim, and glittering, her cloak and cap of snow. It was the Snow Queen. "It's freezing cold," she said. "Creep in under my coat." So Kay, enticed, jumped into the sleigh, and she wrapped the fur around him. He felt as though he were sinking into a snowdrift. "Are you still cold?" she asked, and kissed his forehead. Ah, the kiss was as cold as ice. It went to his very heart, which was already almost a frozen lump, but a moment more and he grew to like it. He no longer felt the cold that was around him. The Snow Queen kissed Kay once more, and then he quite forgot Gerda, his grandmother, and all whom he had left at his home. Kay looked at her. She was very beautiful, and she no longer appeared of ice as before, when she sat outside the window and beckoned to him. He did not fear her at all, and told her that he could do arithmetic sums in his head, and with fractions even, and she smiled while he spoke. On she flew with him, high over the black clouds, while the storm moaned and whistled. Beneath them the wolves howled, the snow crackled, and higher still the moon shone, large and bright. These are the pictures of the sleigh and the Ice Queen. But what became of Gerda when Kay did not come home? Where could he be? Nobody knew. All the other boys could tell was that they had seen him tie his sled to a large and splendid sleigh, which drove down the street and out of the town. Often, very often, Gerda wept for Kay. At last spring came with its warm sunshine. Maybe Kay fell in the river, Gerda said, and she decided that she would go down to the river and ask it what had become of Kay. So she put on her new red shoes and went alone to the river. And she said to the rushing stream, "Is it true that you've carried away my friend Kay? I will make you a present of my red shoes if you will give him back to me." The blue waves nodded in a strange manner. It seemed to her, so she took off her red shoes, the most precious things she possessed, and threw them both into the river. But they fell close to the bank, and the little waves bore them immediately back to her. Gerda thought she had not thrown them out far enough, so she clambered into a boat which lay among the rushes, went to the farthest end, and threw out the shoes again. The boat was not fastened, and her movements made it drift from the shore. She felt it moving and tried to get out, but already it was more than a yard from the land and gliding quickly onward. Gerda began to cry, but no one heard her except the sparrows. So she sat quite still with only her stockings on. Her red shoes swam behind, but they could not catch the boat. It went so much faster than they. The banks on both sides were beautiful with lovely flowers, fine old trees, and slopes dotted with sheep and cows, but not a human being anywhere to be seen. "Perhaps the river will carry me to Kay," she said, and then she grew less sad. Presently she sailed by a large cherry orchard, where stood a little cottage with curious red and blue windows, and before it 2 wooden soldiers stood sentry, presenting arms when anyone went past. As the stream drove the boat quite near the land, she called out louder still, and then an old woman came out of the cottage, leaning upon a crooked stick. She wore a large, broad-brimmed hat that was painted with the most beautiful flowers. "Poor girl," said the old woman. Then she caught hold of the boat with her crooked stick, drew it to the bank, and helped Gerda out. "Come and tell me who you are." When Gerda had told her everything and asked her if she had seen Kay, the woman answered that he had not passed there yet, but he no doubt would come. Then she took Gerda by the hand, led her into the little cottage, and locked the door. On the table stood the most delicious cherries, and the old woman let Gerda eat as many as she chose, while she combed her hair with a golden comb, so it curled and shined like gold. "I have often longed for a daughter like you," said the old woman. And while she combed Gerda's hair, the girl forgot her foster brother Kay more and more, for the old woman understood magic, and she wanted very much to keep Gerda with her. She therefore went out into the garden and stretched out her crooked stick toward the rose bushes. Beautifully as they were blooming, they all sank into the earth, and no one could tell where they had stood. She feared that if Gerda saw the roses, she would remember Kay and run away to seek him. She now let Gerda into the garden. Oh, what fragrance and what loveliness was there! Gerda knew every flower, but however many there were, it still seemed to her that one was missing. One day, while she was looking at the old woman's hat that was painted with flowers, the most beautiful of them all seemed to her to be a rose. The old woman had forgotten to take the rose from her hat when she made the others vanish into the earth. "What?" said Gerda. "Are there no roses here?" And she ran about amongst the flower beds and looked, but there was not one to be found. Then she sat down and wept, but her hot tears just fell where a rose bush had sunk, and, when they watered the ground, the tree shot up suddenly fresh and blooming. Gerda kissed the roses and thought at once of Kay. "Oh, how long have I stayed? I intended to look for Kay." And off ran Gerda to the farthest end of the garden. The gate was locked, but she shook the rusted bolt till the gate opened. Out she ran in her bare feet. At last she could run no longer, so she sat down on a stone. Then she saw that summer had passed. It was late autumn, but no one would ever have known it in the beautiful garden she left, where there were always flowers and sunshine the whole year round. "Dear me, how long have I stayed?" said Gerda. "I must not rest any longer." And she sprang up to run on. At length Gerda had to rest herself again, and there came hopping toward her over the snow a large raven. "Caw, caw," he asked her where she was going all alone. So Gerda told him her whole story and asked if he had seen Kay. The raven nodded very gravely and said, it may be, but now he has forgotten you for the princess." "Does he live with the princess?" asked Gerda. "Yes," said the raven. "Well, won't you take me to the palace?" said Gerda. So the raven led Gerda into a garden, and when the lights in the palace had all disappeared, he took her to the back door, which stood half open. Then they entered the first apartment. Each hall was more magnificent than the other. At last they came into a room where the ceiling was made of great leaves of glass. From this were hung by gold ropes 2 beds, each shaped like a lily. One was white, and in this lay the princess. The other was red, and it was here that Gerda hoped to find Kay. She bent back one of the red leaves and saw a brown neck. Oh, that was Kay. She called him quite loudly by name. He awoke, turned his head, and it was not Kay at all. Then out of the white lily leaves the princess peeped too, and asked what was the matter. Gerda cried and told them her story. "Poor girl," said the prince and the princess, and they put Gerda to bed. The next day she was dressed from head to foot in silk and velvet. They offered to let her stay at the palace and lead a happy life, but she would not. She begged to have a carriage with a horse in front and a pair of shoes, so that she might go forth in the wide world and look for Kay. Shoes and a muff were given her, and when she was about to set off, a new carriage drew up before the door. It was of pure gold, and the seats inside it were piled with sugar plums, fruit, and gingerbread. The prince and princess assisted Gerda into the carriage and wished her all success, while the raven accompanied her for the first 3 miles. Then the raven bade her farewell and flew into a tree. They drove through the dark wood, but the carriage shone like a torch and caught the eyes of robbers. "It's gold!" cried they, and they rushed forward, seized the horses, knocked down the servants, and pulled Gerda out of the carriage. "How plump, how beautiful she is! She looks good enough to eat," said an old robber woman. Then she drew out a knife, the blade of which shone and glittered. "Ah!" cried her daughter, who was very headstrong, "but you shall not touch her. She shall give me her muff and her pretty frock. She shall play with me and sleep in my bed." Then the robber maiden threw her arms around Gerda and said, "They shall not hurt you as long as I am not displeased with you. You are a princess, aren't you?" "No," said Gerda. And she told all that had happened to her and how much she loved Kay. The robber maiden put both her hands in the handsome muff, which was so soft and warm. "If you are naughty," she said, "no one else shall kill you. I'll do it myself." And she led Gerda off to the courtyard of the robber's castle. It was full of cracks, and out of the holes ravens and crows were flying. Great bulldogs jumped up, but they did not bark, for that was forbidden. In the midst of the large, old, smoky hall burned a great fire on the stone floor. They had something to eat and drink, and then went into a corner where straw and carpets were lying. Beside them, on laths and perches, sat nearly 100 pigeons. "They are all mine," said the robber maiden. She seized one by the legs and shook it so its wings fluttered. "Kiss it," she cried, and flung it in Gerda's face. "And here's my dear old back." She dragged a reindeer that was tied up there out by the horns. "Every evening I tickle his neck with my sharp knife. It makes him jump about so." And the robber maiden drew forth a long knife and let it glide over the reindeer's neck. The poor animal kicked. The girl laughed and pulled Gerda into bed with her. "Do you intend to keep your knife while you sleep?" asked Gerda, looking sideways at the knife. "I always sleep with the knife," said the robber maiden. "But tell me once more all about Kay, and why you have started off into the wide world alone." So Gerda told all again. Then the robber maiden wound her arm round Gerda's neck, held the knife in the other hand, and began to snore so loudly that everyone could hear her. But Gerda could not close her eyes. The robbers sat round the fire, sang and drank, and the old robber woman jumped about so that it was outlandish to see her. Then the wood pigeons said, "Coo, coo, we have seen Kay. We saw him in a great white sleigh. He sat by the side of the Snow Queen. They floated low down over the trees as we lay in our nest. Coo, coo." "Where did the Snow Queen go?" cried Gerda. "She has no doubt gone to Lapland, where there's always snow and ice. Ask the reindeer who's tied up here." "Aye, snow and ice indeed. There it is glorious and beautiful," said the reindeer. "You can run and jump about as you like on those big glittering plains." In the morning, Gerda told the robber maiden all that the wood pigeons had said. "Do you know where Lapland is?" she asked the reindeer. "Who should know better than I?" said the reindeer. "I was born and bred there in the snow fields." "Listen," said the robber girl to Gerda. "You see that all the robbers are gone. Only my mother is left, and she will soon fall asleep. Then I shall do something for you." When the robber woman was having a nap, the robber maiden went to the reindeer and said, "I will untie you so that you may go to Lapland. But you must go quickly and take this girl to the Snow Queen, where her friend Kay is." The reindeer leapt for joy. The robber maiden lifted Gerda up and took care to bind her fast on the reindeer's back. "Here are your worsted leggings, for it will be cold," she said. "The muff I shall keep for myself. It is so very pretty. But here are my mother's great fur gloves." Gerda wept for joy. "Don't make such faces," said the robber maiden. "Here are 2 loaves and a ham for you." The bread and the meat were fastened to the reindeer's back. The robber maiden opened the door, called in all the dogs, and then with her knife cut the rope that fastened the reindeer. "Now off with you," she cried, "but take good care of the girl." Gerda cried and stretched out her hands with the large fur gloves toward the robber maiden, and said, "Farewell." Then the reindeer flew in over bush and bramble, through the great wood, over swamps and plains. The wolves howled, the ravens screamed, and the red lights quivered up in the sky. "Those are my dear old northern lights," said the reindeer. "Look how they gleam." And on he sped, faster still. Day and night, on he went. The loaves were eaten, and the ham too, and now they were in Lapland. Suddenly they stopped before a little house, which looked very miserable. The roof reached to the ground, and the door was so low that the people had to creep on their hands and knees when they went in or out. Nobody was at home except an old Lapp woman, who was dressing fish by the light of an oil lamp. And the reindeer told her the whole of Gerda's story. "Poor thing," said the Lapp woman. You have far to run still. You have more than 100 miles to go before you get to Finland. There the Snow Queen has her country house and burns blue lights every evening. I will give you a few words from me, written on a dried fish skin. For paper I have none. This you can take with you to the Finn woman, and she will be able to give you more information than I. When Gerda had warmed herself and eaten and drunk, the Lapp woman wrote a few words on a dried fish skin, begged Gerda to take care of them, put her on the reindeer, and bound her fast. Then away sprang the reindeer. Flicker, flicker blazed the beautiful northern lights, and at last they came to Finland. They knocked at the chimney of the Finn woman, for doors she had none. There was such heat inside that the Finn woman herself wore very few clothes. She immediately loosened Gerda's clothes and pulled off her gloves and boots, for otherwise the heat would have been too great. Then she read and reread what was written on the fish skin. The reindeer told her Gerda's story, at which the Finn woman winked her eyes but said nothing. "You are so clever," said the reindeer. "You can, I know, twist all the winds of the world together in a knot. Will you give this maiden a drink, that she may possess the strength of 12 men, and overcome the Snow Queen?" "The strength of 12 men," said the Finn woman. "Much good that would do her. 'Tis true Kay is at the Snow Queen's. He thinks it is the best place in the world. But the reason for that is, he has a splinter of glass in his eye and in his heart. These must be got first, otherwise he will never go back to mankind, and the Snow Queen will keep her power over him." "But can you give Gerda nothing to take which will give her power and conquer all this?" "I can give her no more power than she already has. Don't you see how men and animals are forced to serve her? That power lies in her heart. If she cannot get to the Snow Queen by herself and rid Kay of the glass, we cannot help her. 2 miles from here are the garden of the Snow Queen begins. There you must carry the girl. Set her down by the large bush with red berries, standing in the snow." And now the Finn woman placed Gerda on the reindeer's back. Off he ran till he came to the bush with red berries, and there he sat Gerda down. Gerda ran on as fast as she could. A whole regiment of snowflakes came rushing against her. They did not fall from the sky, for it was quite clear, with the northern light shining brightly. These flakes ran along the ground, and the nearer they came to the larger and more terrific they grew. They were the advance guard of the Snow Queen. Some looked like porcupines, others like bears with hair on end. All were of dazzling whiteness, all were alive. Gerda began to say the Lord's Prayer. The cold was so great that her breath froze as it came out of her mouth, and she could see it like a cloud of smoke in front of her. It grew thicker and thicker, till it formed itself into bright little angels that grew bigger and bigger when they lighted on the earth. All had helmets on their heads and spears and shields in their hands, and when Gerda had finished the Lord's Prayer, she was surrounded by a whole legion of them. They pierced the snowflakes with their spears and shivered them into 1,000 pieces, so Gerda walked on bravely and in safety through them. Now we shall see what Kay was doing. He was not thinking of Gerda, least of all that she stood before the palace. The walls of the palace were of driven snow. There were more than 100 walls and halls, shaped just as the snow had drifted, and all were lit up so the cold, precise northern lights. By the cold, precise northern lights. All were so large, so empty, so icy, and so glittering. Mirth never reigned there. There was never a ball where the white polar bears danced on their hind legs, never a little tea party for white young lady foxes. In the middle of the empty, endless hall of snow was a frozen lake, cracked in 1,000 pieces, and in the middle of this lake sat the Snow Queen when she was at home. Then she said she was sitting on the Mirror of Reason, and that this was the best and only thing in the world to rest on. Kay was quite blue with cold, but he did not know it, for the Snow Queen had kissed away his feelings, and his heart was a lump of ice. He was pulling about some sharp, flat pieces of ice, which he laid together in all possible ways, puzzling out how to make something with them. He fitted them into a great many shapes, for they were the ice puzzles of reason. In his eyes, the figures he made were exceedingly beautiful and of the utmost importance, but this was because of the bit of glass which was still in his eye. Moreover, no matter how many wonderful words he could shape the ice into, the word he wanted most of all, he could never make them spell. That word was eternity. The Snow Queen had said, "If you can shape out that word, you shall be your own master, and I will give you the whole world and a pair of new skates besides." But he could not puzzle it out. "I am going now to the warm lands," said the Snow Queen. "I must powder my black kettles." This is what she called the volcanoes, Vesuvius and Etna. "It does the lemons and grapes good." Then away she flew, and Kay sat alone in the empty halls trying to solve his ice puzzle. There he sat so stiff and immovable one might have thought him frozen. Suddenly Gerda stepped through the great portal of cutting winds into the palace. She repeated her evening prayer, and the winds dropped as if lulled to sleep. Then she entered the vast, empty, cold halls. There she beheld Kay and knew him at once. She flung her arms around his neck, held him fast, and cried, "Kay, dear Kay, have I found you at last?" But he sat quite still, stiff and cold. Then Gerda wept hot tears which fell on his breast, and they thawed his heart and melted away the bit of mirror there. He looked at her, and she sang that song they had often sung together. "The rose in the valley is blooming so sweet, the child Jesus is there the children to greet." At the sound of the song, Kay burst into tears. He wept so much that the last splinter was washed from his eye. Then he cried, "Gerda, dear Gerda, where have you been so long, and where have I been?" He looked around him. "How cold it is here," he said. "How empty and cold." And he clung fast to Gerda, who laughed and wept for joy. It was such a happy time that even the bits of ice that formed the puzzle on which Kay had been working began to dance for joy. And when they laid themselves down, lo, they formed exactly the letters the Snow Queen had told Kay he must find out if he was to become his own master and to have the whole world and a new pair of skates. Gerda kissed his cheeks, and they grew rosy. She kissed his eyes, and they shone like her own. Once again he was merry and strong. The Snow Queen might come back as soon as she liked. There stood his order of release, the word eternity, written in letters of ice. Hand in hand, Kay and Gerda walked off. Together they left the great hall, talking of their mothers and fathers, of their grandmothers, and of the roses on the roof. And wherever they went, the winds were hushed and the sun burst forth. When they reached the bush with the red berries, they found the reindeer waiting there for them. He carried them to the Finn woman. She warmed them in her hot room and told them what to do on their journey home. Then the reindeer took them to the Lapp woman, who made them new clothes and lent them her sledge. When they reached the country where the first green growing things peeped forth, they took leave of the reindeer. "Farewell, farewell," they cried. Soon they heard the first little birds twittering. And there came out of the wood toward them, riding on a beautiful horse which Gerda knew had once drawn her chariot, a young damsel in a bright red cap with pistols at her belt. This was the robber maiden who was tired of being at home, and had set out into the world. She and Gerda knew each other at once. It was a joyful meeting. "You are a nice fellow," said she to Kay. "I should like to know if you deserve to be run after to the end of the world." But Gerda patted her cheeks and told her their story. "Snip, snap, schnurr, it's all right at last," said the robber maiden, and she took the hands of each and promised that if she should ever chance to pass through the town where they lived, she would come and pay them a visit. Then away she rode off into the wide, wide world. Kay and Gerda walked on hand in hand. It was lovely weather, with flowers and greenery everywhere. Soon they recognized the big town where they lived, with its tall towers, in which the bells still rang their merry peals. They went straight on and hastened up to Kay's grandmother's room, where everything was standing just as they had left it. The clock said tick-tack, and the hands moved round. And there were the roses in full bloom in the window. Then suddenly Kay and Gerda understood that they were grown up at last. Yet they sat down in the little chairs in which they had sat as children, and as they did so, all the cold, empty splendor of the Snow Queen's palace passed from their memories like a bad dream. Kay's grandmother sat in the sunshine and read aloud from the Bible. "Unless ye become as little children, ye cannot enter the kingdom of heaven." Then Kay and Gerda looked in each other's eyes, and all at once they understood the old hymn. "The rose in the valley is blooming so sweet, the child Jesus is there the children to greet." There they sat quite grown up, and in the summer, glorious